So one of the methods that can be used for strengthening the hip flexors, for strengthening the movement of hip flexion, is a heel slide. For the weaker patient, you may want to actually start by placing a towel or something that limits the amount of friction under the foot. If this is in a bed or something that's not as frictionless as these mats, you could actually put the towel on a sliding board to give you something smooth to do the heel slide. So if she's weak, you're going to want to assist her at the beginning with doing a heel slide. So the concentric part of that is the hip flexion part. As the patient gets stronger, you can either add a cuff weight or you could add manual resistance at the thigh to give her something to resist against as she comes into hip flexion. So as she comes into, let's just get rid of the towel for now. And as she comes up into hip flexion, give her some manual resistance. All right, so as you pull up, Kristen, into hip flexion, Leah, resist that. Give her something to resist. Okay, good. So a heel slide with the addition of resistance or manual resistance can be used to strengthen the hip flexors. A straight leg raise is another exercise that can be used for hip flexor strengthening. With a straight leg raise, you want the resting leg in hook line because that takes the pressure off the low back. A straight leg raise can be kind of uncomfortable for the low back if both legs are straight. Not uncommon to have to initially assist a patient with a straight leg raise. In fact, you might have to start with you doing the lifting and let them do the lowering. So start with the eccentric component. As they get a little stronger, working on the isometric use of the hip flexor by holding the leg up. And then as they get a little stronger than that, have them concentrically actually lift the leg into a straight leg raise. In a lot of cases, the rationale for why straight leg raises in the plan of care is really not about the hip flexors. It's just about isometrically strengthening the quads to keep the knee extended. But it definitely is concentric use of the hip flexors, so that could be a hip flexor strengthening exercise. Let's go to cycling. So the use of a restorator, and this is kind of a fancy version of a restorator. Some of them don't have all the gadget attachments. It's just like a pedal that you could put under their wheelchair. Or a regular stationary cycle. If the emphasis is on the pull the leg up part, then one of the things that you're achieving with using cycling is strengthening the hip flexors. Another exercise that can be used for hip flexor strengthening is marching. Whether you're having the patient do that in standing, lifting the knee up. And if they're doing that in standing, they're probably going to either be in the parallel bars or close to something that they can hold on to. Or Leslie's showing that you could do marching exercises seated, like in a wheelchair. You'll see this used like in group exercise classes, would target strengthening the hip flexors. John's going to show that a tap-up is another exercise that can be used to strengthen or have the patient use their hip flexor. So different than a step-up, a tap-up, just concentrically as he brings the leg up to get it on the step, requires him to contract and use the hip flexor. If he's weak enough that a tap-up is a strengthening exercise for his hip flexor, then he also probably needs to be either in the parallel bars or where he can hold on to something. The higher the step that I ask him to tap, the harder the exercise. So for a pretty weak patient, you may start out with a lower step stool and progress that to something a little taller. In the parallel bars, kind of similar versions of that. If you've got a patient that's just doing kind of generic parallel bar lower extremity exercises, that will often include doing hip flexion, either straight ahead like Amber's showing, or with a marching step. Brandy, if you'll change and do a kind of a marching hip flexion. A little slower and maybe just focus on just one leg. Both of those would be versions of hip flexor strengthening that could be done as part of a lower extremity strengthening program in standing, like in the parallel bars or at the kitchen counter. Good. So for strengthening the hip extensors, you have lots of different options, but one of them, especially if your patient is very weak, is to use something called a powder board. So with a powder board in a gravity eliminated position, the patient could work on hip extension with no friction and not having to extend against gravity. So I could either have her do that with her knee extended, like a straight leg raise hip extension, or with her knee bent, like kicking the foot back for hip extension. But this would be a very easy version because it's gravity eliminated and because I'm using what's called a powder board to eliminate friction as a possibility. For a gravity-resisted position, you want to think prone or quadruped for hip extension. So if I do hip extension with the knee extended in prone or quadruped, that's gravity-resisted hip extension. That's a great way to target the hamstrings as a hip extensor because I'm shortening at the hip while they're lengthened at the knee. You could actually toe in or toe out as you do hip extension with the knee extended to make that more of a semitendinosus membranosus or more of a biceps femoris exercise. In prone or quadruped, if you do hip extension with the knee flexed, you kind of take the hamstrings out of that loop, so that becomes more of a gluteus maximus resistive exercise. And you could obviously also add cuff weights to this or add manual resistance to this to make it even more of a resisted exercise. Let's look at Brandy next and look at bridging. Kind of starting to think about closed chain strengthening for the hip extensor group, and that group primarily functions as a closed chain muscle, so working the hip extensors in closed chain is very important. Bridging, if you go, let her go up and down, go ahead and go all the way down and all the way up, is a good closed chain exercise for the hip extensors that can be a precursor to something like working on sit to stand or squats or lunges because it's not as body weight resisted, but it's still using those hip extensors in closed chain. So this is a good exercise you can use early for your patient with hip extensor weakness to start to progress them toward being able to come from sit to stand or some of those kind of functional activities. In standing, if we'll look at John and Brian, squats or lunges are both other closed chain ways to work on strengthening the hip extensors, because in both scenarios, if y'all both just keep going, the concentric part of a squat or a lunge is the coming back to standing part. So when they come up from a squat or a lunge, that's concentrically using their hip extensors, and as they lower into a squat or a lunge, that's eccentrically still using their hip extensors. John's going to show a step up as another exercise for strengthening the hip extensor, so a little bit more aggressive. So as he comes up, brings his body up the step, he's concentrically extending the hip. So the higher the step that he has his foot on, the more aggressive of strengthening exercise that is for the hip extensor. In the parallel bars, let's look at that next. Just kind of along the lines of those standard parallel bar exercises. One of them could be just open chain, taking the hip back into extension. So not uncommon to see that part of the parallel bar exercise group of exercises would be taking the hip open chain back into extension. And another common one that's usually part of that set of exercises is mini squats. So not all patients are appropriate for doing full deep squats, but mini M-I-N-I, not M-A-N-Y. M-I-N-I, squats, just taking the patient through a small range of a squat is a good way, closed chain, to work on using the hip extensors. Stationary cycling, we looked at a minute ago as a way to strengthen the hip flexor, but depending on which part of the cycling move you're having the patient focus on, the push or the pull, it could also be used as strengthening for the hip extensor. So if I focus on having the patient push as they cycle, with each push, the concentric part of that, one of the concentric parts of that is hip extension. Still's kind of sticking with the closed chain concept. Let's look at Alicia. And I want to remind you that anytime you're standing on one foot, anytime you're taking one of your feet off the floor, the leg that you're standing on, the abductor and the extensor on that side are the two muscle groups that are stabilizing the pelvis. So this may not look like much in terms of strengthening the abductor or the extensor, but just to keep the pelvis level and not let it collapse on the other side or collapse to the back means she's isometrically using her abductor and her extensor. This will be a really big deal when we start doing gait analysis, because with weakness of either of those groups, you start to see really funny things happen to the pelvis when one foot leaves the ground. So just standing on one foot is strengthening the hip extensor on that side. Now the longer I keep her on one foot, and one way I can do that is by having her tap up to a step. So as she taps up to the step with her right foot, she's having to isometrically use her abductor and her extensor on the left side. So the taller the step I give her, or the more complicated the movement I give her to do on the right, the longer she's having to stabilize on the left. I can make that even more aggressive by putting her on something unstable. So if I get Kristen to stand on one foot, and I'm not going to let you lock your knee, don't lock that right knee, and I'm not going to let you let that left leg come in. Just standing on one foot on something unstable, I know she's using her abductor and her extensor on the right. And then if we added something more complex to this, like I had her tap balloons, or reach and touch my hand in different positions, or do some movement with this opposite leg, then I'm making it more challenging for her to stabilize with those right hip muscles. Leah's going to show that if I have you squat about halfway, just stay in that position. This time go down and stay. That a squat, or this is just a different version of a squat, I can make it more of like a stabilization or an isometric exercise by making her hold that position. And again, I could give her something to do with her upper body. We could be batting a balloon or reaching and touching. To make her stay in that position longer would be isometrically strengthening her hip extensor. Okay, so for strengthening the hip abductors, you may have to, if your patient's very weak, you may have to start with a gravity eliminated position like supine. And again, the use of a sliding board or a powder board or something to eliminate friction makes that easier. As the patient gets stronger, you wouldn't have to have those substitutions. But supine would be gravity eliminated for that and would be an easy position for working the abductors. In side lying, if we'll move over here to Alyssa, side lying is a gravity resisted position for hip abduction. So this is a really common exercise to use for strengthening the hip abductors. But the quality of this movement is very important because patients will cheat when they're weak with their abductors, either by letting the leg roll into external rotation, in which case they're really doing hip flexion and not hip abduction, or they'll let the pelvis kind of roll back, and again, they're trying to use their hip flexor when their hip abductor is weak. So you want to make sure when they do this that their pelvis is in the right position and that their toes are pointed straight ahead and not rolling up toward the ceiling as they do their hip abduction. Let's go here to the step. And I'm going to remind you that just like with the hip extensor, the hip abductor, let's just do it the right way to start with and then I'll talk about the wrong way. The hip abductor is one of those two muscle groups that when you're in single leg stance, your abductor is contracting to stabilize your pelvis. So really any exercise that involves a component of single leg stance is a strengthening exercise for the abductor. It's having to stabilize your pelvis. The longer they have to stay in single leg stance, the more challenging that is. So I might start with a tap up on a shorter step, progressing to a tap up on a taller step to keep her in single leg stance longer. Now someone with a weak abductor may, when they go to single leg stance, let this hip poke out. Really what's happening is the opposite side of the pelvis is dropping. If it's very weak, they actually might lean toward their weak side to shift their center of gravity. So if you're using this as a strengthening exercise, you don't want either of those two things to happen. So you're going to cue them to try to tuck that hip in as they step up with their other foot to use that abductor. Good? Let's go to the parallel bars. Feels it. Okay, as part of that group of exercises that are the parallel bar exercises, just one of the ones that might be included in that generic list of exercises could be abduction, holding onto the parallel bar and standing. You could use a kitchen counter if this is a home health patient, and really, to be honest, she's using her abductor on her left leg as much as she's using her abductor on her right leg, because when her right leg leaves the floor, she's stabilizing using her left abductor. Now John's showing, we haven't used cable weights a lot yet this semester, but the cable weight system, or in a minute we'll be looking at TheraBand as an option. You can really use the cable weight for strengthening any of the hip movements. He's right now showing resisted hip adduction. Just by changing his body position, he could do resisted hip abduction. And again, changing the body position, he could do resisted hip flexion or resisted hip extension. So cable weight, kind of along the same lines as TheraBand, which we'll show here in just a second. depending on where you tie the TheraBand or where you orient your body, that can provide resistance for that movement. With TheraBand, we'll go to this front corner. So Kristen's just demonstrating that you can use TheraBand as the resistance for hip abduction. You can change the intensity of that either by giving a different color of TheraBand, or don't forget that the lower I place that TheraBand, like if that TheraBand resistance was at her ankle, it would be more challenging and more resisted than if I placed the TheraBand at the thigh. So lever arm length for the resistance can also affect the intensity of that. And then finally, let's look at AMPA. Remember the enclosed chain, the abductor acts to level the pelvis. So a good closed chain exercise for the abductor group is in standing to let the opposite side of the pelvis drop and then to level that back out. So as she repeats that movement, she's using her abductor on the standing leg to control that pelvic movement. So this is a good closed chain exercise for the hip abductor group. For strengthening the hip adductors, you could use supine as a gravity eliminated position, again starting with the sliding board if the patient was very weak, to target strengthening the adductors. When the patient's ready for a gravity resisted position, then if we'll go to Kristen, side lying on the side that you want to target for strengthening, you can do gravity resisted hip adduction. You really want to make sure they're not substituting with the trunk and that the leg is staying in the right position to be adducting. You can use TheraBand or a cable weight system to do resisted hip adduction to provide resistance to that movement. Or Diane's showing that in the parallel bars. One of the exercises that might be included for your parallel bar exercise program, just standard exercises to be done in standing, would be hip ab and adduction. So you can address it there too. Cut, and then another thing to remember with the adductor group is that the adductors also function as hip extensors when you're extending from a fully flexed position. So in exercises like squats and lunges and step-ups, when you're doing resisted hip extension from a flexed position, the adductor group fires and participates in that. So you're strengthening the adductors also when you're strengthening hip extension from a fully flexed position, like with a squat or a lunge or a step up. Okay, for strengthening or providing resistance for hip internal and external rotators, one option for that is in short sitting. Short sitting is gravity resisted for hip internal and external rotation, so you can add a cuff weight as one way to add resistance to that. You want to really monitor the patient's trunk and pelvis and make sure they're not kind of rising up with their pelvis when they do that movement. Another option instead of a cuff weight for that would be to use TheraBand for resistance. So in short sitting, depending on whether Tim positions himself medially or laterally, he can be in a position to either resist internal rotation like he's doing now, or he can be in a position to resist external rotation. So that's another way to do strengthening or resisted exercises for the hip rotators. Prone is another position that with the addition of, in this case, a weight, but you could also use TheraBand for this. In prone, coming from full external rotation to neutral is gravity resisted, and coming from full internal rotation to neutral is gravity resisted. So a cuff weight would work for resisted strengthening for rotation, but so would standing on either side using a piece of TheraBand would also be a way to do resisted hip rotation strengthening. In closed chain, you need to remember that when you rotate toward or away from a planted foot, that lumbopelvic rhythm, part of that's coming from hip rotation. So as Courtney rotates to the left, she's using her left hip internal rotators and her right hip external rotators. And if I were her PT watching her do this, I would say don't pivot those feet. Keep your feet planted and facing straight ahead. There you go. And so as she rotates, part of that's coming from the trunk, but as soon as the pelvis moves, she's also doing hip internal and external rotation. John's going to show that with a cable weight, you could do the same thing. So with the feet planted, as he does resisted trunk rotation, as soon as the pelvis moves, that's also resisted hip rotation. So with him rotating to the left, he's using his left hip internal rotators and his right hip external rotators. And then all he would need to do is change his body position, and we could target the opposite muscle groups in each hip. Right hip internal rotators, left hip external rotators. There's a group of exercises that you might see documented as total hip exercises or total hip replacement exercises. It doesn't necessarily mean you would only use those with a patient who's had a hip replacement, but it's just a good collection of exercises that can be done in a hospital bed that are basic lower extremity exercises. One of the included exercises would be ankle pumps, and so this is really important for the ankle, but really more important for circulation reasons to try to prevent the development of a DVT. So the patient really should be doing ankle pumps all throughout the day, but definitely as a component of their total hip exercises, you would have them do active ankle pumps. Another exercise that's always included with total hip exercises would be heel slides. And if it's actually a total hip patient, you don't want them to flex their hip past 90. If they're supine, they're not going to flex their hip past 90 doing a heel slide. If their hospital bed is in a more of a seated position, you'd have to be more careful with that. But heel slides and also hip ab and then adduction back to neutral. And at first you might have to do those assisted, but your goal is to progress that to the patient being able to do that actively and independently. Ab and adduction back to neutral. A short arc quad, Courtney's going to show. So an SAQ or a TKE, terminal knee extension, or a short arc quad to strengthen the quads in that last range of knee extension. You can use a bolster preferably. If you don't have a bolster, Diane's kind of showing that there is a way you can either use a pillow that's doubled up, or you can use your own arm kind of as the pivot point for giving them something to do a short arc quad using. Let's go to isometrics next, and then I'll talk about this one last. In terms of isometric exercises, you want your patient doing glute sets, which you can just tell your patient to try to kind of tighten their bottom, squeeze their gluteal muscles. And if it's an isometric exercise, we usually want them to like hold it for 5 or 10 seconds and relax and repeat that maybe 10 or 20 reps. For quad sets, and that one can be tricky, you want the patient to tighten the quad. Not all patients get what you mean by that, so you may have to give them something under their knee that they can press against and ask them to press their knee down against your hand or down against the bed. Sometimes that works. And then for ham sets, you're going to ask the patient to dig the heel down into the bed. So they're doing resisted hip extension or resisted knee flexion to kind of isometrically fire the hamstrings. The last one I'll show you is a straight leg raise. And not all orthopedic surgeons are crazy about straight leg raises for their actual total hip replacement patients. So in your list, I had you kind of put an asterisk by straight leg raises. If it's actually a total hip patient, you need to find out if straight leg raises are okay or not. But with a straight leg raise, you want the resting leg in hook line, take a little pressure off the back. This is one of those exercises that you might have to start with the eccentric part, progressing to the isometric part, and finally progressing to the concentric part. Or you might just have to do these assisted until they develop more strength in those muscle groups.